Well, you all did a wonderful job with your tours. Thank you so much. Very informative. I'm sure we all learned something. And if you ever have guests or visitors from out of town, you will feel very comfortable taking them around and showing them, some of the highlights of Buffalo. I'd like to now break into two smaller groups. We've got a little group work to do that will, I think, reinforce some of the notions and things that we've talked about and give you some more food for thought about your experience doing these tours. So we will just take a break for a moment, get you organized into groups a little bit better rather than everyone facing front. And then I will give you a chance to look over the questions and we'll talk about them as a group. Okay? Sound good?
Yeah.
Okay.
Good.
Let me know.
Go.
Alrighty, so I have some questions prepared for you. And the first two are sort of softballs for you to think about, each one of you individually, about the experience that you had. Hopefully you found something really exciting, really interesting to talk about. The first question is, what was the most interesting thing or surprising thing that you learned about Buffalo during the course of doing your research for this assignment? And the next question, you could probably combine that answer if you wanted to. What one fact or piece of new information that you learned are you really excited about sharing with others? In other words, if you were part of a conversation about architecture in Buffalo and suddenly you've got something to add to that conversation, what's the one thing that you would sort of say, hey, I feel really good about knowing this? Okay, and then, so that'll be individual. Each one will give a response on that. Then what I'd like to get sort of a sense from the group is, and either everybody can speak individually or you can assign one person to speak for the group. Do you feel any differently about Buffalo now that you've done this assignment? Now that you've really studied at least 7 different places in depth, a little bit more than you did at the beginning of the term about Buffalo and its history. Has it changed your attitude a little bit? A lot of us are big Buffalo boosters, no question about it. We've always had a bad rap. We struggle with that from the days of Johnny Carson making, bad jokes about Buffalo. Our sports teams, you name it, the snow, we struggle. And a lot of us feel pretty good about it, but sometimes it's easy to get kind of down on it. Has your learning about the city changed your attitude at all? And then the final question is, do you feel that knowing about a subject or a place or a thing gives you, does it change your attitude about it? The more you know about something, does it help to change your attitude? So those are the things I'd like you to discuss among yourselves. And I can come around and see if you have any questions about that. So if you wouldn't mind getting started, that'd be great. And I'll see how you're doing. I'm sorry to interrupt. I know it's hard to stop talking once you get talking about these topics. Everybody's had enough time to examine some of the questions and do a little thinking about your own experience? Okay, great. Then what I'd like to do is go around to everybody and ask you the individual question, and then we'll come back and we'll do the group questions. So Robert, if we can start with you. What thing dazzled you in Buffalo, and what did you learn, and what were you pleased to learn about?
I didn't realize how important Frank Lloyd Wright was in American architecture.
Okay.
Or that the Martin House is one of the best examples of prairie style architecture.
Okay.
That was one of my most interesting.
Oh, that's great. In your experience, did you learn anything about the relationship between Frank Lloyd Wright and Darwin Martin?
Yes, it was interesting to learn between the relationship between the two, how difficult Frank Lloyd Wright could be to work with, and how much Martin respected his genius. Additionally, how he supported Wright through difficult times in his life.
That's true. Darwin Martin was the CFO of a company called the Larkin Company, which was one of the first mail order companies, and they did soap and dry goods and such. He was a huge fan, and he convinced Larkin to actually build an industrial building. We'll talk a little bit about that afterwards, but then he wanted his own personal house built in that style. Started with a house for his sister, a very modest house, and then expanded to the big, so there are really the 3 buildings on the property there. There's a legend that, in fact, no, it's actually, there are letters. The letters between the 2 of them still exist. And one of the theaters in town here did a show about it, about the relationship between Martin and Wright. And he wrote to Wright and said, the roof is leaking over my desk. And Wright wrote back, said, move your desk. Wright wasn't that interested in the structural components of his building. He was much more interested in the, you know, the beautiful style and blending in with the landscape. That was his, you know, if it leaked, so be it. That's the cost of, you know, living in a house like that. Roger, would you share with us your big fact?
Yeah, well, I guess the first thing I didn't realize was that what a complete destruction of the city of Buffalo took place in the War of 1812. It was burned.
Okay,
Essentially, no residential properties remain.
right.
And this guy Coit, George Coit, who was a businessman, is considered one of the founding fathers of the city of Buffalo as we know it. And the other thing that was interesting, I never knew what Federalist style meant, but it's essentially a very plain rectangular structure with a center entrance and symmetrical windows.
So the Coit House is still here.
It's still standing.
and
It
it's-
was on the Wreckers Ball 25 years ago. It was moved from its original site on Pearl and Swan to Virginia Street where it is now.
That's right, and I believe it's privately owned, saved actually by a corporation. Probably the oldest residential structure, like you said, the British fire, the British burned Buffalo, wiped out everything, and he had the means to rebuild fairly quickly, and built that house. From what I understand about it, of course, they didn't have motors or anything, it was a team of horses that dragged that house from where it was on Pearl Street to where it is on Virginia. Great, thank you. Marlene,
Yes.
what was your big reveal?
Well, I was telling everyone that for years I had seen the green elevators and thought they were kind of ugly. And, you know, why were people taking pictures of them? And then this summer, when my sister was visiting, my mother, my sister, and I went on a river tour. And fascinating. We didn't do the tour of the elevators themselves because that involved climbing a lot of steps, and my mother wouldn't have been able to do that. But it was very interesting just to imagine what life was like in those days when there were a lot of people working. And I was thinking about Bethlehem Steel and how there was a whole culture that grew up around Bethlehem Steel, and wondering more about the culture of the grain elevators. But I think the fact that I liked the best about this was that all of the Cheerios in the country are made in Buffalo.
That's right. That's the smell as you go around the 190. You know, there are T-shirts that say, "My city smells like Cheerios." Okay, great. Thank you so much. Darlene.
I looked at the Buffalo Park system, and it was very interesting. Fred Olmsted developed the park system. What I found out was it is the oldest park system in the country, and he did it in a style called the Emerald Necklace.
Emerald Necklace. Describe what that means for us.
The Emerald Necklace is about the broad parkways that connect all the different parks that he designed. And so, for example, Richmond Avenue connects to Delaware Park to Front Park.
Right.
And we use these broad parkways to do that. Part of the other parks that are in there, besides Delaware Park and Front Park, MLK Park is in there, South Park has part of their own part of the Olmsted Park system.
Right.
It's very interesting. I went to New York City with my mom and found out that the Central Park is also designed by Frederick Olmsted.
He did, right. Right. He had a partner, Calvert Vaux, that, you know, we sometimes lose sight of. Everything around here was named for Olmsted, but he did have another partner. Yeah, he did very significant parks around the country, and other cities saw what we did here, and he did similar designs for Boston, Chicago, and, you know, the Emerald Necklaces, if you imagine the parks as the green emeralds and the parkways connecting. That was a very revolutionary idea. The idea of having recreational space in an urban setting when people were, you know, not that we were packed in like they were in New York City, but still not having to go out to the country, but still having recreational space close by was a very novel idea. Great, thank you so much. Barb.
Okay, I did about the Lafayette Hotel. I was always interested in the Lafayette Hotel because when I worked downtown, it was when it was in disrepair, and it was a rooming house, so, and you couldn't even really walk by there because it was kind of scary.
Yeah.
So, and I always was fascinated by the building. So when I did research on it, I realized, I didn't know this, it was the first female architect in the United States was Louise Bethune, and she lived and worked in Buffalo. And she was the first woman associate of the American Institute of Architects. And she designed many buildings and schools, including the Lafayette Hotel. And I got to, and when the hotel was getting refurbished, I would visit, and the workers would allow me to go in to see what they were doing.
Lucky.
So I always enjoyed watching it get redone, and I know it cost $35 million to refurbish it.
Yeah.
So they have it switched now. They have 92 apartments, and they have 57 hotel rooms, and then they have the banquets.
So it's a
hall
mixed-use
downstairs.
facility these
Yeah.
days.
But it's absolutely beautiful. They did a wonderful job on it.
Good. Oh, glad to hear. All right. Camila.
I looked at the Michigan Street Baptist Church,
Uh-huh.
which is a historical black church in Buffalo. And I was surprised to find out that I actually took a tour of it. And it was a big part of the Underground Railroad.
Yeah.
Enslaved people who were coming from the South stayed at the church. There was a place that is actually now a bathroom under a stairwell,
Mhm.
a little tiny space. They would hold like 3 or 4 people under the steps in this area until it was safe for them to get transportation to Canada.
Mhm.
And that was something surprising that I learned.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much. Michelle.
Well, I did a little research on our ballpark in Buffalo. I'm a big baseball fanatic, and I was really happy when Jimmy Griffin, our old mayor, decided to spearhead building what was once called Pilot Field. I guess a lot of people know it by different names because the ballpark had so many different names due to naming rights and a lot of companies not being able to afford the big bill to have the name. So one of the surprising things, though, was that the ballpark was actually nameless in 1995 when Pilot Air Freight lost their naming rights because they couldn't pay the bill.
Okay.
So for part of their season, the ballpark didn't have a name. They just called it the downtown ballpark, and nobody really owned it, so to speak. I thought that was neat, and what was even neater to find out was in 1998, and obviously this is a little more current history than some of you, we had a ladies' professional baseball team that played out of there.
I did not know that.
I did not either, and I love baseball. Had no idea. So I thought that was really neat. And lastly, getting into the architecture type discussion, the original Statler Hotel used to occupy Swan and Washington Streets,
Okay.
which is where home plate is, at the
Okay.
ballpark.
All right. All right. Very interesting. Thank you for sharing. I knew nothing about that. It's a shame that you have to pay for the rights because it seems fitting that maybe one day we would name it Griffin Field. I mean, he was a unique individual. He
Unique,
really
and I
was.
mean, he
Yeah.
was not gonna let that idea die
Nope.
for nothing.
Nope. And, you know, for once we got something built downtown. Yeah, right. Great. Sarah.
Well, I had the Ainsley Wilcox Mansion.
Okay.
And I had forgotten that an American president, William McKinley, had been assassinated in Buffalo in 1901, and that the vice president, Theodore Roosevelt, was inaugurated right here on Delaware Ave at the Wilcox Mansion.
Let me jump in and ask you, what was McKinley doing here in Buffalo? when
He was at the Pan American Exposition.
Pan American Exposition. Everybody familiar through the reading and things we've done about? Okay. That was a big deal. That was really the crowning jewel of Buffalo's achievement at that time.
City of Light.
The City of Light, really, one of the first electrified cities, as we spoke about. And of course, the book that I recommended to you, the Lauren Belfer's book about, it's a historical fiction, but it really does bring a lot of, you know, that turn of the century history about Buffalo into the plot. Tell us more about the Wilcox Mansion.
Wilcox Mansion is a classic example of Greek revival architecture.
Okay.
It looks like a Greek temple.
Mhm, mhm.
The columns and the triangle-shaped pediment over the porch are key elements in Greek revival.
Okay, wonderful, thanks. Let's see, anybody visit the Wilcox Mansion?
I looked it up on my phone.
Oh, good. Hopefully you did a little more research. You shouldn't have told me. No, don't tell me that. You just did a whole presentation on it. It's really a neat place. It's one of those things that, again, we almost lost. It had been turned into a restaurant, a tea room, what have you. They moved some interior walls, but, you know, fortunately the right people got their hands on it. And one of the really interesting things that they have there is a costume museum. Not that you can really go and see these things, but they are taking care of clothing, particularly women's clothing, like 150 years worth of stuff. You know, they'll have teas and bring things out. Okay. So the big picture questions. You feel better about Buffalo now than you did at the beginning of the class? Did this experience give you some food for thought, make you think a little bit more about, you know, being a citizen here and what the city has to offer? Yes?
Absolutely.
Right, okay. I'm leading the witnesses. What do you think about when you get to know about a place? How does that change how you feel about it when you learn about stuff?
I think you take ownership of it.
Okay,
You know, you have a sense of pride.
right,
You have a connection to it.
okay, good. Anybody else?
A sense of pride.
Yeah.
I agree with that.
Okay, thanks.
I was gonna say, when you visit another city, it's always interesting to look at their history, and so then you know what to look for when you get there, and you know a little bit about it, and you have, you know, that connection as well.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, because you can always find something, perhaps you can find something similar to something in your city,
Mhm.
you know, so.
Wonderful, thank you very much. Well, thank you all very much for your insight. I think you did a lot of great work with the tours that you did and thinking about how learning about a place affects how you feel about it, and changes that you may feel going forward when you think about the city, when you talk about it. I want to show you one quick thing, just by way of wrapping up, and that is the notion of things that we have lost here in the city. We talked about Frank Lloyd Wright. Well, this building, that is the administration building for the Larkin Company that he built in 1904 at the request of Darwin Martin. Darwin Martin was an employee of John Larkin and was a big fan and talked his boss into having Wright build that building. Well, the city of Buffalo tore that building down. And now that you know a little bit more about Frank Lloyd Wright, how important he was, what an interesting personality he was, you think a little bit more about, wow, we had something like this and it's been lost, and you can never get something like that back again. Larkin went out of business, the city took it for taxes, they sold it to a company that then tore it down to make a parking lot. And you know, the more I got to learn about Frank Lloyd Wright and his impact in the city and, you know, his importance nationally and internationally, the more it hurts to think that we lost something like that. So just something, little food for thought. I want you to think about, you know, what we have, what we've lost, what we need to preserve. So again, thank you. Thank you very much.